Hello, everyone. We're going to start the session for the afternoon now, and we have many people contributing to this session. The first talk will be given by Clahsen and Verissimo, who is a postdoc at the University of Potsdam. His research interests include lexical representation and morphological processing in native and non-native speakers. And the larger theoretical questions that form the background for his work concern the debates between symbolic and associative models of language and cognition, the psychological reality of grammar, and the contrast between nativist and empiricist approaches to the origin of linguistic knowledge, topics that are dear to the hearts of some of us. And his co-presenter is Harold Clahsen, also from the University of Potsdam. He's the co-director of the Potsdam Research Institute for Multilingualism. His research has focused on developmental language disorders and grammatical processing in native speakers and language learners using psycholinguistic experiments. In addition to multilingualism, grammatical processing, and language disorders, his research interests include theories of morphology and syntax. He is a fellow of the British Academy and a member of the Academy of Europe. That talk will be followed by a wonderful experiment in distance learning. It is given by Jennifer Manley, who's an associate professor of neuropsychology in neurology at the Cognitive Neuroscience Division of the Taub Institute for Research on Alzheimer's Disease and the Aging Brain. At this moment, she is in Brazil, which is why she is not here. And her co-author, Laura Zahadny, who's an associate research scientist also in the Department of Neurology at the Cognitive Neuroscience Division. And the discussant for this session will be Randy Engel, who is professor of psychology at Georgia Tech and interim director of their Center for Advanced Brain Imaging. His research focuses on memory capacity and its relationship to attention control. He's argued that individual differences in the construct measured as working memory capacity reflects differences in the ability to control attention to internally generated and externally elicited representations, and that differences in this ability is an important component of general fluid intelligence. So the afternoon session will work very similarly to the way the morning session worked. We'll have each of the talks and the discussant, and then all of the speakers with Professor Stern replacing Jennifer Manley so that we actually have somebody in person to whom questions about Dr. Manley and Dr. Zahadny's talk can be addressed. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you very much. Virginia, can you hear me? Thanks for the invitation to fill this slot. It came with a bit of a surprise to us, but because we also probably represent an outsider's perspective on this topic, more from a linguistic side of things. I also like to apologize to our discussant. Is that better? Yes. I'm sorry. Okay. But you didn't say that you didn't hear me. I also like to apologize to our discussant for sending the slides rather late. Our planning for that was suboptimal, I must say. Anyway, in this talk, we will discuss methods for investigating grammatical processing in bilinguals, focusing on morphological priming studies. we will make 3 methodological points. We will try to illustrate that linguistic, in our case, morphological considerations in constructing experimental materials are beneficial. We also propose a design that allows for direct, within experiment and within participant, comparisons of critical conditions, which we also find beneficial. And in our case study, we employ data analysis techniques that make both linear and nonlinear gradient effects visible. We believe that these considerations are not only relevant for morphological priming experiments, but for studying bilingual language processing more generally. Yeah. Here's a quick overview of the talk. I will present the less interesting part of the talk. The interesting part of the talk will actually be given by Joao. I will give a bit of background on grammatical processing in bilinguals, some background, some linguistic considerations, specifically inflection and derivation, and then some remarks about priming, morphological priming experiments, and the benefits of these experiments. And then in part 2, Joao will present our case study for today, a mass morphological priming study in Turkish-German bilinguals to investigate the role of age of acquisition for morphological processing by directly contrasting the processing of inflection and derivation and discovering a surprising selective age of acquisition effect that is related to the critical period hypothesis. You may ask why, in the context of the specific topic of this workshop, we should be particularly interested in morphology and morphological processing. Well, it's true that important work on bilingualism has shown that while lifelong bilingual language use may lead to enhanced general cognitive abilities, with respect to executive functions, language proficiency and verbal fluency is typically worse in bilinguals compared to their monolingual peers, the good and the bad of bilingualism, as we all know. But most of the experimental work on the advantages and disadvantages of bilingualism has focused on vocabulary and the processing of simple words. From a linguist's perspective, vocabulary is a rather peripheral aspect of language, and claims about effects of bilingualism that are based on tasks that only tap into vocabulary and verbal fluency may not necessarily hold for bilingual language proficiency as a whole. We may ask whether grammar and grammatical processing is overall worse in bilinguals than in monolinguals, or whether there are more subtle similarities and differences. One may even speculate that supposedly superior cognitive abilities of bilinguals could be beneficial for grammatical processing skills, in that an advantage in executive functions may also have other beneficial effects on brain networks that control grammar and grammatical processing. Perhaps bilinguals even outperform monolinguals on some grammar tasks. Experimental research on grammatical processing in bilinguals has focused on late bilinguals and on the question of similarities and differences between native and non-native processing of grammar during reading and listening. How to explain the differences between native and non-native processing is controversial. We may distinguish two very broad accounts. One view holds that L1 and L2 processing share the same system and mechanisms, but that L2 processing is more demanding in terms of basic cognitive processes and is also affected by the learner's native language. In work with Claudia Felser, I have proposed an alternative view, namely that the L1, L2 differences are more subtle and more interesting, perhaps. We propose that L2 learners' ability to make use of grammatically based parsing is reduced relative to their sensitivity to lexical, semantic, and other non-structural information cues, with the consequence that L2 processing relies more on lexically stored information and less on grammatical parsing than L1 processing. In this talk here, we will go beyond this familiar L1 versus L2 controversy by investigating not just late learners, but a wider range of bilingual speakers. The results we are presenting come from a large-scale experimental study of the bilingual German-Turkish community in Berlin, which is a large urban population of individuals who have learned Turkish from birth, with German coming in at different ages, depending on their life. Some of them are simultaneous bilinguals, learning both German and Turkish from birth. Others are successive bilinguals with exposure to German coming in later in childhood when they enter kindergarten or primary school. And there are also many late bilinguals in this community. The demographic structure of this relatively homogeneous community provides a unique opportunity, we think, to compare different kinds of bilingualism. In this research, we asked two questions. Firstly, how bilinguals' grammatical processing in German is affected by its age of acquisition, factoring in, of course, proficiency and other relevant factors. And secondly, how their performance in Turkish is affected by attrition. Here, for this talk, we will not talk about Turkish. We will focus on the first question, presenting experimental results from a study with almost 100 bilingual participants from this community, investigating age of acquisition effects on their morphological processing skills in German. Now, a bit of linguistic background. For me as a linguist, it's crucial that a phenomenon that is examined in an experimental study is properly understood, and that the materials are designed carefully. In psycholinguistic and neurocognitive research on language, this is sometimes a bit neglected. Materials are carefully matched for surface-level properties such as length, bigrams, frequency, orthographic overlap, but not for more deeper linguistic properties. Often, such deeper linguistic properties, for example, semantic transparency or linguistic similarity, are simply considered from subjects' ratings without any theoretical background or attempt at understanding the linguistic phenomenon at hand. I put an example here from a 2011 study by Kila and Johannisse, but I could give many others. Here is how I think this should be done. The specific phenomenon we investigated for the current study was morphological processing, specifically inflectional versus derivational morphology. What are the similarities between the two? One crucial linguistic difference between inflection and derivation is that derivation creates new lexical entries, whereas inflection is normally excluded from any word formation. A derived form such as affordable, for example, can be fed into further derivational processes, producing affordability, unaffordability, etc. But regularly inflected forms such as walks or islands, they cannot undergo any further word formation processes. Another difference between the two is that the products, you will see later on why this difference is important. So don't get bored. Another difference is that the products of derivational processes take on a linguistic life of their own, so to speak. In that they typically have their own grammatical properties and meanings, much like morphologically simplex words or compounds, whereas inflectional forms are simply exponents of syntactic features. Derived forms may even serve to name concepts or objects, just like any other lexical item. Take the word coldness in English, for example. This denotes a property of the base word, the state of being cold, a simple case of recategorization of an adjective to a noun. But the cold, with zero derivation, refers to a more specific concept of a particular illness. Such cases of labeling yield semantically richer and often idiosyncratic meanings that are not predictable from their grammatical components, unlike inflection. And that's important to keep in mind. Morphologists try to capture the difference between derivation and inflection in terms of different kinds of roles. What these roles basically express is that inflectional rules just spell out particular sets of syntactic features, for example, tense, person, or number. But they do not constitute lexical entries themselves of any kind. By contrast, the output of a derivational rule is a lexical entry, a unit of storage, so to speak. So what this means is that all derivational processes produce independent words, things that can be stored in memory. Whereas inflectional processes are dependent word forms that just spell out features, but otherwise do not have a life of their own. Okay, a little bit more linguistics on the particular phenomenon that we examined. In the experiment Joao will present, we tested two morphological phenomena of German, an inflectional one and a derivational one. The inflectional phenomenon is past participle formation, which is in many ways the functional equivalent of the English past tense. When you say in English, I bought a book, we say, ich habe ein Buch gekauft, with a past participle. In addition to a closed class of irregular forms, participle formation involves a perfectly regular and productive process of T-suffixation, much like ed in English, that do not have any stem changes. So there are no stem changes with these. Note that the GE prefix is not a morpheme. It's just determined by the word's stress. So it's only added when the stem is stressed on the first syllable, but not elsewhere. So we have gekauft from kaufen, but not geverkauft from verkaufen, because of the stress pattern. The derivational phenomenon we examined is deverbal nominalization with the highly productive suffix ung. These forms, for example, Öffnung or Reinigung, do also not involve any stem changes, like the inflectional phenomenon. They are comparable to ing nominalizations in English, things like opening or cleaning. So we are comparing a minimal contrast, two highly productive affixes, t and ung, none of which involves any stem changes. The difference between the two is that the derived forms, unlike the inflected ones, may have additional meanings or labels, something that characterizes derivation. For example, the German word Reinigung may refer to the process of cleaning or purification, but may also refer to a place, namely a dry cleaner's shop. So we have a minimal and meaningful contrast between morphological conditions that we are comparing in our study. As psycholinguists, we do not only describe these morphological phenomena, but in addition, we also ask how morphologically complex words are processed in real time, in production and comprehension. Here our focus is on comprehension, with the aim of determining the nature of the morphological or morpholexical representations the system relies on during comprehension. We specifically ask, are inflected and derived words segmented into their morphological component parts during comprehension, and how are they represented in lexical memory? Not at all, combinatorially, or as wholes. To gain insights into these questions, priming experiments are particularly useful. In morphological priming tasks, participants are presented with a morphologically complex prime word before a different word form with the same stem as a target. For example, walked, as a prime for the target walk. For the target word, participants have to perform a lexical decision task, for example. A robust finding from priming experiments is that response latencies to target words are shorter when they are preceded by a morphologically related word than by an unrelated word. In some cases, even the same amount of priming on target recognition times can be found for a derived and an inflected prime word as for an identity prime. Morphological priming effects have first been reported by Stanners and collaborators in 1979 and have since been replicated in many studies. Stanners explained morphological priming effects as follows. He said, or they said, the base verb and suffix are partitioned prior to memory access, and the base verb is then directly accessed. In other words, a word form such as walked, presented as a prime, is decomposed during recognition according to its morphological structure, walk plus ed, thereby isolating the base stem, which then directly facilitates recognition of the target word. Different priming techniques are available. Primes and targets may be presented in the same modality or cross-modally. For example, primes visually and targets auditorily. Primes may be presented long enough to allow for overt recognition or in a visual mask for a short period of time, which only allows for partial recognitions. Targets may be presented immediately at the offsets of the prime or with a delay. There are a large number of variants of this task. Amongst these different priming techniques, for the current purposes, the masked priming technique is of particular interest, as it is said to be specifically sensitive to morphological relatedness. In masked priming, a prime word that is usually not consciously identified is briefly presented between a forward mask and a target word, to which a lexical decision is made. Findings from a large number of previous priming experiments with native speakers revealed significant facilitation, that is, priming effects when the prime word was morphologically related to the target, but not when it was only orthographically or semantically related. Katie Rustell and colleagues found the same priming effect for pseudo-affixes, such as the ER in brother, as for semantically transparent forms, such as employer. On the other hand, a segment such as the EL in brothel, which is not an affix in English, did not produce a priming effect in this task. So the point being is that the priming effects in this task are triggered by a pre-lexical parsing mechanism that strips off potential affixes from the stem, irrespective of its meaning or function. So the masked priming technique then provides a suitable task to examine whether bilinguals decompose morphologically complex words during visual word recognition. Another what did I do? Sorry. Another methodological point to keep in mind concerns the choice of the appropriate statistical techniques for data analysis. Recall our initial research question. The purpose of this study was, or is, to determine how the morphological processing skills in German, in these German-Turkish bilinguals, are affected by the different ages of acquisition of German. Our sample of over 90 participants deliberately covers a range of different ages of acquisition, including early, sequential, and late bilinguals. Age of acquisition may have a gradual, linear, continuous effect. Perhaps the earlier one has started to learn German, the stronger the priming effects, the more native-like the priming effects. Age of acquisition may also have a non-gradual, discontinuous effect on morphological processing. Perhaps there is a critical period for the acquisition of grammatical skills in some way, for example, until the age of 6 or 7, as some have claimed? If so, one would expect that for this age band, morphological priming effects are stable, and that after that, that is outside this period, gradual changes may become visible. These are, of course, just speculations at this point, but in order to examine whether or not they are correct, we need data analysis techniques that make both linear and nonlinear gradient effects visible. And Joao will show you how this can be done.
Thank you. So to summarize what Harold said, in the experiment that I'm presenting, we have employed a priming paradigm to serve as a diagnostic for the processing of morphological structure. We are directly contrasting inflection and derivation on the basis of the linguistic distinction between these two morphological phenomena. And our main research question is the role of age of acquisition in the decomposition of morphologically complex words. Like Harold said, age of acquisition effects can be thought of as linear or non-linear in some linguistic measure. And this is an important distinction because it aligns with two very different conceptions about the role of age of acquisition. In one of them, that we could term earlier is better, age of acquisition is a crucial predictor of linguistic performance, such that a later age of onset of learning will then predict decreased levels of ultimate attainment. So ultimate attainment being the asymptotic level of linguistic competence that would be reached after years of learning or of exposure. But a very different conception could be termed something like use it or lose it. In the words of Pinker, maybe language acquisition is actually guaranteed up to the age of, let's say, 6, steadily compromised up until puberty, and rare thereafter. So this is not a continuous, gradual effect of age of acquisition. It actually involves a discontinuity or a non-linearity in the function that relates age of acquisition to linguistic attainment. In fact, this is a formulation of the critical period hypothesis, vigorously defended by Lenneberg, amongst others, which is that for first language acquisition, and then this was extended to second language acquisition by Johnson and Newport, there is an early window of heightened sensitivity to linguistic input. And during that circumscribed period, language acquisition is thought to be guaranteed and very much homogeneous between speakers. Outside of the boundaries of this critical period, one then finds substantial heterogeneity amongst speakers, an increased role of extraneous factors, and achievement is seldom native-like when learning started later in life. One way of visualizing these proposals is by plotting age of acquisition on the x-axis and some measure of linguistic attainment or competence on the y-axis. An earlier is better position would correspond to a linear effect of age of acquisition. That's what you see in the leftmost panel here, such that the later the onset of learning, then the worse the ultimate attainment. But a use it or lose it perspective, or a critical period hypothesis, would correspond to what we see in panels B or C, amongst other possibilities. In panel B, what we see is this early window, which would say be from birth until, let's say, the age of 6. And during that window, then speakers are homogeneous. That is, if you start learning a language, let's say at age 4 or 5 or 6, then your processing and linguistic competence would be native-like. After the boundaries of this critical period, then there is a progressive age-related decline in language learning ability. And in panel C, what we see is a progressive decline that would start from birth onwards, let's say until puberty, but then after the boundaries of this critical period are over, there is nothing more to be lost in a way. So language learning would have to rely on general purpose mechanisms, and learning a language, let's say at 40, would be the same as learning a language at 20. So these are two possible depictions of a critical period hypothesis. And in the experiment that we conducted, we actually demonstrate precisely such a discontinuity, a non-linearity, much like what we see in panel B, not for a measure of linguistic attainment, but for a measure of linguistic processing, as evidenced by the masked priming paradigm. So we use the masked priming paradigm in which prime words are not consciously perceived. The primes are masked in between a row of hash marks and the target that participants need to make a decision on. The prime words were either inflected or derived forms, so like Harold said, either T participles or derived ung nominalizations in German. And these were both priming exactly the same target, infinitives in German. So we have a very tight within item design that allows us to contrast these two linguistic phenomena for the same speakers and the same items. We also employed control conditions, testing for priming effects between words that resemble one another in terms of shared letters, and also words that share meaning. It is a problem in morphological research that morphology co-varies with form overlap and meaning overlap. We wanted to make sure that the effects that we would find could be attributable to morphology and not to overlap in these other levels of representation. Our main predictor, like we said, is age of acquisition, but importantly, we are controlling for factors that co-vary with age of acquisition, that correlate with age of acquisition. We used measures of proficiency in German, of exposure to German, and of daily, everyday life usage of German, or of dominance between German and Turkish. We wanted to make sure that any effects would be attributable to age of acquisition and not to any of these other factors that correlate with age of acquisition. Participants in our experiment were 91 Turkish-German bilinguals drawn from this community in Berlin, all native speakers of Turkish, but they all started learning German later in life, some of them at birth, so they are simultaneous bilinguals, learning both Turkish and German from birth, but others acquired German later in life. And we have a very wide range to test for age of acquisition effects from birth up until the age of 38. Our measures of the, let's call it the covariates, proficiency, exposure, and usage were the Gotha placement test. We can see that the mean in our sample is 25 out of 30, so we're dealing with a highly proficient sample. Our measure of exposure was length of residence in Germany as a whole, or on average. Our sample has been living in Germany for more than 20 years, so these are very immersed bilinguals. And our measure of use of German consisted of questions about how much German is used in different domains with family, friends, work, etc. in a typical week. The mean is 44% of usage of German, meaning that on average, these are balanced bilinguals using German and Turkish more or less the same amount, perhaps in different domains of life, but more or less in the same amount. The procedure in a mask priming experiment consists in the presentation of the prime sandwiched between a row of hash marks and the target. Participants are required to make a lexical decision on the target. They need to decide whether the target is a word or not, and then we measure the response times on the target after the prime has been presented immediately. Before, in comparison to an unrelated condition in which primes have no relation whatsoever to the target. We have employed, like I said, both T participles and ung nominalizations. What is particular about the mass priming procedure is that because the prime is only presented for a very short period of time, 50 milliseconds, and in between these two visual events, the mask and the target, then the prime is effectively invisible in conscious terms. So if you ask participants, they haven't seen anything whatsoever. But in reality, their processing has been affected, and they will be, we presume, faster to make decisions on the target after seeing a related form as a prime. We employed 28 morphologically related prime-target pairs. You can see examples here. So the target would be andern to change, and this could be preceded by one of 4 types of prime, either andern itself, which is an identity prime. We are using this to test for repetition priming effects. Anded has changed, so the inflected participle form of exactly the same verb. Anderung, the change, the derived form based on the same stem, and an unrelated control word, a noun or an adjective that had no relation whatsoever to the target. And we also employed, like I said before, semantic and orthographic control conditions, but importantly, we tried to make sure that when we tested for orthographic priming effects, that these materials would mimic what is happening in the morphological conditions in terms of letter overlap. So half of our prime target pairs are things like Clahsen, Kasse, in which the overlap is in the initial letters of both the prime and the target, much like what happens in the derivation condition. And the other half of the prime target pairs are things like Engel, Geld, in which the overlap in letters are actually in the final letters of the prime, much like what happens in the inflectional condition, ended. And we measured response times to the target after priming participants with both inflected and derived forms, excluding slow or error-prone items or participants. Our dependent measure was the log of response times. And by and large, people were very accurate in this task. We only had about 5% of incorrect responses. We analyzed our data in 2 main ways. One, testing for linear effects of age of acquisition, and the other one precisely searching for discontinuities or non-linearities in how age of acquisition might relate to priming effects. Linear effects were tested by means of mixed effects regression. The main factors were prime type and age of acquisition. Importantly, prime type was coded in a way that each effect was compared to the control, so to the unrelated prime. So every effect that we find in our statistical analysis is a priming effect relatively to this baseline. And age of acquisition was introduced in these statistical models uncentered. And what this means is, in our statistical analysis, we try to predict the priming effects for the simultaneous bilinguals, those that acquire German and Turkish from birth, and then we test for any interactions between age of acquisition and the type of prime to see if the effects that we find for the simultaneous bilinguals are then modulated across the age of acquisition range. So to see if they change for people who learn German later in life. And these are the results of our mixed effects model for the morphological set. You just need to focus on the bold ones. These are the 3 significant effects. And what this means is that there is significant priming for inflected forms, for derived forms, and significant identity priming when participants have learned both German and Turkish from birth. So people are faster to make decisions when they see related words that are related morphologically. But importantly, what this effect here shows is a significant interaction between inflectional primes and age of acquisition. So what this means is that even though if you learn German and Turkish from birth, you show inflectional priming, then the later German is learned in life, then that inflectional priming effect decreases. For the semantic set, so for those items that overlapped in terms of meaning, we didn't find any priming effects, we just found repetition priming and no modulation by age of acquisition or by proficiency in any of the other covariates. And the same thing happens for the orthographic priming set. That is, when primes and targets overlap in terms of shared letters, in terms of form, then there is no significant priming. Neither for morphological priming or for the orthographic and semantic set, any of the other factors played any role. So proficiency and length of residence in Germany and usage of German didn't play any role in priming effects. So to summarize, early bilinguals show morphological priming, no semantic or orthographic priming, but then that inflectional priming effect decreases when language is learned later. This is a highly selective effect of age of acquisition, because as we found, age of acquisition does modulate the relationship between an inflected form and its stem, but does not play any role whatsoever in derivational priming, neither in identity or repetition priming, and neither in orthographic or semantic priming. We seem to have discovered a very precise and selective effect of age of acquisition that aligns with a linguistic distinction. After that, we asked, can we actually find evidence for a critical period in this age of acquisition effect? Or to put it in different words, can we find evidence for a non-linearity in the function that relates age of acquisition to priming effects? Recall the possible geometries that have been proposed. We are grabbing the same rationale here, but instead of relating age of acquisition to linguistic attainment, we are placing priming effects, inflectional priming, on the y-axis. But the rationale is the same. We are testing these models against our data. On the leftmost panel, we have the linear effect, and then in the middle, we have what could be termed a stretched 7 configuration, and on the rightmost panel, we call it a stretched L configuration. And to this one, we added another one in which we could have differing slopes. So to make this more precise, these three are the types of nonlinear models that we tried to fit to our data. And the method that we used is called regression with breakpoints, which is basically just two linear regressions linked at a certain breakpoint, with a flat part on either side of the regression, or maybe with slopes differing. And it is possible to actually fit these three types of regression to our data, and then we choose what the best model is. But importantly, we didn't assume where the breakpoint was from the start. So instead, what we did was an iterated procedure such that we fit a regression with breakpoints at every point of the age of acquisition range, and then we measure how well that model captures the data in terms of a measure of goodness of fit. In this case, AIC was used, a measure that penalizes complexity because we also want to favor simpler models. And by doing that, we can not only see if we end up with something that explains the data better than a linear model, in which case what we're asking is there a breakpoint? But also we can ask, where is this breakpoint? Where will we find the evidence for this discontinuity? And for each of these models, as you can see in the bottom panels, These are the measures of how well the model captures the data. Lower is actually better. So lower AIC means a better model. And what you see is after we fit these models against the data, only this small subset of models is actually better than a linear model. The goodness of fit of the linear effect is visualized by this dashed gray line here. And only for the stretch del configuration, when the breakpoint was for this range of early ages of acquisition, that's where we found that we were capturing variance in the data better. And indeed, the best model for our data actually looks like this. For inflectional priming, what we find is that priming effects are actually constant in between, for participants that acquired language in between 0 and 6. And it's at 6 that we find this breakpoint, and after that we find a sharp decline in inflectional priming effects. Both of these effects being significant, both the priming effect for inflection and the declining slope. This model was also revealed to be better able to capture variance in the data than a linear model. This is the crucial effect that, that shows the presence of a nonlinearity. For derivational priming, you can also see the depiction here, which is that there is no evidence of a breakpoint, but also there is no modulation by age of acquisition. This is what we found in the linear analysis before, if you remember. So priming is actually constant across the AOA range. On a second analysis, we employed a different statistical method to detect nonlinearities. That was LOAS, or local regression. What makes LOAS particularly interesting is that it requires very minimal assumptions about the shape of the function that we're trying to detect. So while in the regression of breakpoints, we were trying very hard to not assume too much. We would let the data show us where the breakpoint was and what type of model should be favored. But still, we are making certain assumptions. We are putting two linear regressions together, and we're trying to detect if there is one single breakpoint. In lowest regression, this is all very free. Any kind of shape might appear. It's kind of like a moving window that goes through the AOA range, and then all sorts of curvatures could appear at any point. But the downside of that, or the trade-off, is that this sort of technique doesn't lend itself too well to inferential statistics and p-values. So it's more of a visualization technique rather than an inferential statistical technique. LOAS is controlled by this span parameter, and this span parameter is how much data influences the fit at any given point. Higher spans, what they do is that they smooth a curve, and they smooth it so much that at some point it appears like a linear model. And if the span is reduced, then you start having so much curvature and so much wiggliness that at some point you're basically overfitting the data, and you're actually fitting the noise rather than the signal you're trying to get. So it's a bit tricky to figure out what the best span might be, but typical values are usually in the range of 0.25 and 0.75. And what we see here is a comparison of two values, 1 and 0.75. 1 in the dashed gray line, I hope that's clear, is almost a linear model, so there's a very slight curvature. But as soon as we relax the span a bit, so as soon as we allow for a curvature in the data, immediately the shape that emerges is a fairly constant effect in inflectional priming up until the ages of 5 or 6, and at that point a sharp decline in inflectional priming that remains gradual and constant with no further curvatures across the AOA range. So we end up with a shape that looks very much alike what appeared in our regression with breakpoints, only here it's a type of analysis where we don't actually assume any kind of breakpoint and we just let the best curvature appear. So the results are very consistent between these two statistical methods and can be summarized as such. Age of acquisition effects reveal a number of very interesting properties in explaining morphological priming effects. They are discontinuous, non-linear. They show up on this priming task, which measures linguistic processing at very early stages of orthographic and morphological processing. It also seems to be an effect that is very specific to inflected forms. And what this suggests to us is that we might have found a critical period for the acquisition of inflectional rules, insofar as morphological priming is tapping into the decomposition of complex words. And this decomposition procedure is dependent on morphological knowledge and on the representation of inflectional rules as part of linguistic knowledge. Then it is possible that after a certain age, extraction of these inflectional rules from the linguistic input is made more and more challenging. It needs to be compensated in certain ways, for instance, by storing different inflectional variants of the same verb. And that would be the source of our reduced priming effects after AOA of 6. The results also support a sharp distinction between inflection and derivations, so they support linguistic perspectives that make a distinction between these two morphological phenomena. But more importantly, the results suggest that there is substantial within language modularity. So besides possible representations of linguistic knowledge in modular terms in respect to other cognitive processes, within language itself, it would appear that global measures such as proficiency or how good people are at German cannot really capture the subtleties of the types of linguistic knowledge that are employed in processing. In fact, it would seem that there are different levels of representation within language, like linguists have pointed out many times before and in many different approaches, and also that effects of bilingualism and that linguistic abilities might differ or might show different critical periods or different effects of age of acquisition for certain linguistic domains, but not others. In general, we would say that an explanation of our results cannot be easily achieved by invoking global processes, extraneous factors, things like slower processing, influence of an L1, etc. It would appear that such a selective effect requires a selective explanation, and that would be the progressive loss of a particular language acquisition ability, which is the acquisition of grammatical expression, so of inflectional rules. Thank you.